Hello, Internet. My name is Bret. This is my channel. I'm live every week on Thursdays, usually with guests, sometimes without, but it's all about showing you some stuff in DevOps, containers, Kubernetes, Docker, all those things, and then taking your questions. So that's why we do this live, to get you involved as well as taking your great questions, because often it makes a better conversation when you ask questions. So today, I'm very excited because we have some special things happening, including a special guest and a fundraiser, which is our first time doing this on this channel. So I hope you will support us. Real quick, in case this is your first time or you're watching this later and it's not live and you didn't know, we do this live every week, and you can support this channel, including the podcast, the live coding, all like the open source on GitHub, basically all the stuff that I do out here free for y'all is supported through Patreon. So if you can go to patreon.com/Bret Fisher, you don't have to give me any money for coffee, you can simply click the follow button and you'll get a weekly email about who's going to be on the show, what things I'm releasing, what new courses updates are happening, all that stuff, right? It's just what's new in my content and my live show and podcast and everything else. So do that. Or if you want to get a part of some extra benefits, you can be one of our patrons. I think I have over 100 now and excited about that. So we do this cool thing every month where we actually meet on Discord and we do a little sort of coffee hangout where we just talk about DevOps projects. It's full of people that are DevOps professionals or looking to be, mostly DevOps professionals, that are just talking about what they're learning, what projects they're running. Maybe someone brings some Docker files or some YAML to look at for us to all sort of weigh in on. So if you're interested in that, sign up for the High Fivers here. That's what that group does once a month. And it's been fun. I feel like I've got like a little community of friends that we hang out with on there that we do it every month. And same people show up all the time. So I encourage you to check that out. We also have a Discord server right up there. And I think that's it. All right. So let's get to it. Today on the show, we have David Flanagan, also known as Rawkode. Hello.
Hi there. Excited to be here. It's going to be fun.
Yeah. I've been on... We've done things before. We're part of like this community of live streamers talking about DevOps and Kubernetes and stuff. So I feel like we're kindred spirits on the internet.
Yeah, we found a really good way to avoid doing any real work, right?
Yes. Couldn't have imagined a more complicated thing because it seemed so simple when we started.
Put on a camera, invite a guest, and here we go. It just magic happens. No, that's a lie. There's so much work that goes into this, and I really appreciate and respect the effort you put into your channel, man. You're doing great.
Well, thank you, and same to you as well. If you didn't know, Rawkode is over here on YouTube as well. And to support his efforts for supporting Ukraine, today we're doing a fundraiser live stream. So that means that YouTube, basically, if you donate, we're choosing the UN refugee as our charity, our refugee support, basically, as our charitable efforts today. So if you have some spare change and you want to support this channel supporting that fundraiser, you can click the donate button in chat, and then Google evidently does it right on screen and sends it over to the UN, I guess. So you can check out Rawkode. He does this really cool thing called Klustered. Can you just tell us what Klustered is?
Yeah, of course. So Klustered is a competitive Kubernetes, if there is such a thing, and that I spin up some bare metal clusters and give them to people, and I tell them you've got 48 hours to go smash this cluster to pieces. Like, just break it, do whatever you want. And then the teams or the solo guests will join me live and attempt to fix each other's clusters. So what's really special about it is that you get to see how people think and debug potentially real broken clusters. Well, they are real broken clusters, but real outages that could happen to anyone. And it just really is a really interesting way to get that knowledge of how to operate Kubernetes from people that do it day in, day out. So
yeah, so you can check that out on YouTube on his channel. I will send you over to the videos. Actually, I'll just send you the channel link, everyone. And I think that's a really interesting idea. Have you had a challenge getting people to be on? I mean, that's kind of a vulnerable situation. You got to be pretty confident in your skills to be public on the internet troubleshooting a server, right?
I like to think that I give people enough support in it, but it's definitely people are intimidated by it. Like, it's not just live coding. Like, you're actually giving people this broken cluster and saying, do you know how to work it? What is wrong with this? And it is very intimidating, but we're all smart people, and sometimes we just need a bit to slow down and talk about the problems. And it's through those conversations around what's going on with the cluster that we learn more about how to make it work, right? Like, yeah, I think every valuable lesson we've had, I'll just speak for everybody now, I'm feeling that confident, but that, we learn through failure, right? We never learn when we're getting things right. It's only when we do something wrong, we go, oh shit, like, okay, there's something to learn, and now I'm not going to do that again. It's the best way.
Yeah. I always feel like I feel like my learning capacity is tenfold when production is down. Like, there's something that's I mean, maybe that's not quite what you're able to replicate there, because if I lose, I lose, but in 45 minutes or whatever. But I tell you what, like, there's nothing more nerve-wracking than a team trying to bring up something in That's the hug ops that we talk about on Twitter all the time, is when we see real systems on the internet go down, like this is the stuff that teams are made of, right? Like it's sort of, you prove your chops when how quickly you can diagnose and recover from failure, and no matter how much planning you do, it always seems like chaos a little bit. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, we do our best to prepare for these situations, but you have to go through those situations in order to have seen the symptoms, work out how to quickly identify them, understand what the reconciliation path is. It's just, it really is the best way to learn. Like, I mean, we've all dropped a production database at one point in our careers, I would assume, right? And have you done it twice? I mean, I hope not. If you have, oops, hopefully you've not done it a third time. But I mean, I've dropped the production database, and I certainly haven't done it again since. And it's just because you learn a lesson, and you learn it for life.
I did do that very early on, like on my first major Docker project, like 7 years ago. I was working with a team for a Big 5 accounting firm, and we inadvertently deleted the volume of the database. And I learned, I learned very quickly. Luckily, we had backups.
Well, I mean, if you don't have backups, you've also learned you need backups, right? There's always a lesson in failures. And just hopefully the blast radius of that first failure isn't too bad.
Yeah. I think I love it when people put their disaster stories on Twitter. I always chime in because I feel like I have some pretty epically big ones that, especially when you talk on stage and you go to conferences, people always assume they assume you know all the things, and they assume that you're battle tested or whatever when you stay on stage. And that's not always true, right? A lot of us are just winging it as we go anyway. And so I'm always trying to say, no, I have made, if there's a mistake to be made, I've definitely made it. Like, I've made big ones. I think I took down Netflix's blog on Thanksgiving one year. Like, there's some stories I have that are like, people are thinking, you still work in this industry because you did that.
Well, the people at the top of this industry are the people that have made the most mistakes. I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
Sounds like a Yoda quote.
Yeah. The people that have made one mistake in their entire career probably, well, I mean, I can't make any assumptions there, but they've not learned enough lessons yet, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great, we could talk this whole episode about it, but we're not here for Klustered. Go over to Rawkode's channel for that. Here today, we're talking about GitOps, and so you're at Pulumi. So we've done some talks on Pulumi before at this show, but let's get some definitions and stuff out of the way. Like, let's just start with Pulumi, the product, so people know what that is.
So Pulumi is an infrastructure as code tool. It allows you, using the supported programming languages, to define what your infrastructure, your cloud resources, your GitHub teams and organizations look like. Supported languages are JavaScript and TypeScript, any of the .NET languages. So that's F#, C#, Visual Basic, if you really want to go down that path. We also support Python. If I forgot one, not sure. But you can use a language, hopefully, that is familiar to you and start describing your infrastructure. So whether that be, I want an EKS cluster on AWS, whether I want a JKE cluster on Google Cloud, maybe I want both. Then we can write a bit of code that says this is the new resource. We give it a name. We apply some metadata and properties to it: the size of the cluster, the size of the VM, the S3 bucket name, the ACL on the S3 bucket, whatever. And then run Pulumi up, and voila, we have all of these cloud resources that we wanted. People are typically familiar with Terraform. Pulumi is pretty much the same thing, only Terraform went down the route of having a DSL, HCL. Whereas Pulumi decided that real programming languages would allow us to have slightly more flexibility in what we do with our infrastructure as code.
Right. And for those of you, you can search YouTube for Pulumi. There's tons of people talking about it. Our friend Victor over on, his channel is the DevOps Paradox is his podcast. I forgot Victor's channel's name. Oh my goodness.
Why can I not remember that name?
Yeah, anyway, Victor Farsick. Okay. Everybody look up Victor Farsick. That's a great channel, as well as Rawkode's. Pulumi has a channel. Like, there's becoming a lot more stuff out there. I think when Victor first told me about it, or I learned it from Victor, I don't know, a year ago or whatever, I was vaguely aware of the name, but didn't really understand the difference between that and the other choices. And I actually really like this title at the top of the website, the developer first infrastructure as code. So I come from a background of ops. So even though I I do have done programming for probably 30 years. I've always been in the operations role, and in a lot of organizations, especially traditional organizations, unless you were a mainframe operator, operators often weren't programmers. So I feel like a lot of these YAML based or HCL based toolings are great for people who are not strong in any one at least popular language and aren't used to that. And there's a lot of those people out there, especially on the Windows side, because that's kind of my traditional, came from the Windows side. A lot of sysadmins, and Bash programming was about as advanced as we got usually. And I love that there's the flip side of this, that, hey, there's so many developers out there that are being thrown the DevOps ball, like they're being thrown the responsibility of more DevOps things. And maybe the ops team is either non-existent or not big enough to really take on that work. And I love giving developers the idea that they don't have to learn like they can just use the language they're comfortable in, and they can just stick with what they know rather than having to learn a whole nother layer of tooling languages inside of YAML and TOML and HCL and all these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like programming in general, right? There's this full spectrum of where people lie on it. Some people love to immediately think about how to optimize and have efficient programs with their own abstractions and condense everything down to really small functions. And then there are some people that just want to get on with their day and get the job done and just write big, massive functions. And neither is right or wrong. We all have a preference. Yeah. And infrastructure as code tools are the same. Like, people may just want to write YAML or JSON and use CloudFormation, and that's fine. Some people may want to use or learn a DSL like HCL, and that's fine too. But what I've seen in the industry is that as the adoption of platform engineering is on a rise, where we have specific teams that build platforms for developers to consume, is that having programming languages that allow us to have a function called create a project or create a platform and not really expose what that is really powerful. And I think Pulumi is a really cool tool that just kind of sits in there and lets people do that if they want to.
Yeah. By the way, I don't know what happened to my screen. All of a sudden it decided to not show.
Well, you found the DevOps toolkit. There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking for DevOps toolkit. What is going on here? Okay. Yes, actually, Engineering. Hopefully I pronounced that close enough. DevOps Toolkit, YouTube DevOps Toolkit. That's Victor's. And so this leads us to the conversation that you and I had about what the topic of the show is going to be around GitOps, because I don't think I've gone a show in a year and a half now and not used that term. Probably 2 years now. Every show I've mentioned DevOps or GitOps is a part of it, and I don't. Obviously it's not in the title of the show. It's not the focus of the show, but I feel like this is really just the evolution of our patterns into a way that we all are starting to agree on how we implement infrastructure and infrastructure change through version control, essentially, even though it's always usually Git. Can you talk a little bit about the GitOps approach and what your view of that is?
Yeah, well, let's talk about what happened before GitOps, and then I'll pivot back around, right?
Sure.
But for the last 10 years, perhaps a little bit longer, we've seen this shift with developers and operators adopting continuous integration and continuous delivery. And the way that that's worked for the last decade has been that we monitor some version controlled repository, typically Git, that when pushed to the main branch, we trigger some workflows. Jenkins was ubiquitous here for a long time, but now we're seeing things like Circle CI and GitHub Actions. But the ability to codify a workflow that runs on the change of code allows us to have this thing that updates whatever we want, right? So if we have infrastructure as code that says I need a VM with this user data, this IP address, and maybe a load balancer in front of it, then I can describe that. And whenever I change the code or my team change the code, that will automatically reconcile, and we're all very happy. And that's been working really well for a long time. However, there's one thing that we didn't, well, I guess we did anticipate, but maybe didn't think would have such a large effect on these systems, and that is people. And I say that with a little bit of anger, is that people like to do things to make their jobs easier or faster. And there's drift. The concept of drift is really, really important. And what I mean by that is that we can have this wonderful automation, this continuous integration and delivery, everything's in Git, But at the end of the day, is it impossible for someone within your organization to go into the cloud portal console thing and click buttons? And the answer is yes. Like they can. They can go and create new resources. They can edit existing resources. They can be testing things. Maybe there's an outage, right? And maybe the fastest way to get things back online for your customers is to go into a portal and click a button rather than waiting for that CI or CD system to run. And that is what we call drift. When the state of the world is affected by something outside of the automation, and we need ways to be able to reconcile that too. So if we make changes outside of the automation, well, the automation isn't going to know that that happened until the next time we push to the main branch and that automation runs again. And hopefully the drift isn't too large that it can be reconciled. But it's very common for the changes to be so complex or have collateral damage that the changes can't be reconciled. We end up in a broken state, and then you've got a choice of building a new environment, reverting all the changes, or you don't know, throwing your hands up in there and saying, "Screw it, I'm going to the pub." Difficult challenge that, and that's why. Yeah, and that's what GitOps tries to solve, right? Is that we don't wait for code changes to handle reconciliation. We actually monitor as close to real time as we can, because we understand that the world has side effects. Things change, people click buttons, even cosmic rays can change bits on a hard drive. We've seen that before. A really cool article I'll try and paste drop into the chat. But there's all these things that can affect our infrastructure, and GitOps is a control loop that runs inside of your Kubernetes cluster, or maybe even just on a server, that is constantly refreshing the state of the world and saying, do I need to reconcile anything back to this predefined state that we have inside of our source code?
Yeah, the first, I think some of us were trying to accomplish some of these things before GitOps was a term, and what I've loved about the last, let's say, 3 years or so, is it's caught on really fast, and now we're starting to see the tooling. Well, we're seeing tooling now that is designed around the idea of GitOps, rather than us trying to shoehorn in an existing older tool into the approach that GitOps takes, and that was, we saw that first with containers, where nothing was designed for a container, and now we have container support everywhere. It's in our editors, it's in all our tooling. It's just by default, it's all in the CI tools, everything. And I feel like the same thing's slowly happening to GitOps, where this approach of I start to ask vendors now on the show when we have new products on the show. Maybe it's a hosting platform, or it's something that affects your infrastructure, and it's some third-party tool. My ask is usually, okay, so you say you support GitOps, but if I go in your web interface and I change something, does it get reflected in my Git history, or is it out of the GitOps approach, and I've bifurcated and broken everything? And it's funny because it's caused some really interesting conversations where people are saying, well, no one's really asked for that, but I do see that that has been a problem where people go in and touch things outside of the robots. And all of us were trying to do this 10 years ago. A lot of us were trying to do this 10 years ago on AWS, and it was a nightmare because people would just go in AWS and click buttons, and then it would undo all of our automation. So
happens all the time, right? Like we can try and put best practices in, or who can make changes to the back end, but at some point, something's going to drift. And GitOps is a really cool methodology that allows us to at least try and not stop it, of course, but to try and minimize the collateral damage of that drift by reconciling as fast as we can.
Right. And so presumably, Pulumi can help us with this.
So Pulumi can. I think one of the things that Pulumi does really well is we get this rich interface. Because we're using programming languages, I can use VS Code plugins, right? So when I write in TypeScript, I'm getting autocomplete for my infrastructure, for my Kubernetes custom resources, for everything. It's just such a cool tool. And then when we layer in GitOps, Pulumi becomes even more powerful because we can run Pulumi has a Kubernetes operator that runs inside of your cluster, will monitor your Pulumi projects from a Git repository. And whenever something drifts or changes, it will reconcile that straight back to what we want. So you can continue to use all these cool patterns that Pulumi exposes end to end, which I think it makes it even more powerful because I'm not just using Pulumi to spin up my Kubernetes cluster. I'm running Pulumi inside of my Kubernetes cluster and then using Pulumi to deploy all of my Kubernetes objects. And that end-to-end workflow is just super cool.
Yeah. Yeah, because Pulumi is way bigger than just Kubernetes, but it's great that you've dialed down into Kubernetes and sort of become a first-class citizen inside of a cluster.
Yeah. I mean, you can define a stack inside of Kubernetes. You could just use kubectl to apply it, but you can use Pulumi to apply it too. And there are benefits to sticking within the Pulumi ecosystem. I think we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I just think that the interface that Pulumi exposes for all of these resources is great because it's something that's never really been a good developer experience. I've written a lot of Terraform in my life. I've written a lot of Troposphere. I've written a lot of Chef and SaltStack and Puppet, all of these amazing tools. But whenever I'm in my IDE and I'm trying to write a new, Chef cookbook, playbook, Ansible playbook, Salt manifest, or even HCL, the level of autocomplete and awareness has always been a little lackluster, to the point where I think, and I'll speak for myself and not for everyone, but there was a lot of copy pasta going on. Like, I'm always going to the docs, finding an example of how to spin up a Kubernetes cluster, pasting it into my thing, making the changes that I think I need, and then going through a test phase, which is really just run the Terraform me up and then see if I get what I want, and if not, make a change and then run it again. And that's my test process, and it's slow and painful. And to bring Pulumi back into the conversation now, is that because we're using programming languages, we have autocomplete and language servers that knows what all these objects look like. And you can actually just tab your way through a resource that you've never seen before and get it to be successful. And not only that, we have access to all the testing infrastructure for all of these programming languages. So if you want to do TDD for your infrastructure, then you can do that. And it's a lot faster than spinning up VMs and user data and checking to see if it works and spinning it back down and repeating that way. So,
right. By the way, for everyone watching, the links for these GitHub repos that we're looking at, we're just looking at, are down in the description below. You can. The thing that I wanted to ask you up front was, you sent me these links, and what is the difference between these two? What is the difference between the operator and the resource provider?
Yeah, of course. So the Pulumi Kubernetes resource provider can be used with any Pulumi program and will create deployments, services, config maps, any Kubernetes resource. The operator is responsible for running inside of the cluster and executing a Pulumi program for you.
Okay. So when would you use these separately?
So you would write a Pulumi program that used the Kubernetes provider, describe all of your Kubernetes resources, and you could just run Pulumi up on your terminal, and it would all just work. The operator comes in when you want to automate that further to the GitOps workflow. So you would push your Pulumi code to Git and then deploy the operator to the cluster. And then its responsibility is really just to say, has this Git repository changed? Has the state of the world changed? And at any point in that time, to make sure that the Pulumi up happens to bring things back in line. So you typically use them both.
Right. So the resource provider, let me see if I can say it a different way if I got it correctly. So the resource provider is so that Pulumi can talk to my cluster directly, essentially?
Yeah.
Is it like a conduit to the Kubernetes API kind of thing?
Yeah, it speaks to the API server. It speaks the API server language, and it can create and patch resources for you.
Yeah, so that sounds like the way I get started maybe is that's something I maybe would do, and then once I've understood that stuff, then I want to go more advanced into GitOps, and I want to actually have the cluster automating itself and rectifying the difference between the cluster itself. That's when the operator comes into play, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, people are more familiar with Terraform, right? It's been a huge part of this infrastructure as code thing for the last 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer. But the Pulumi and the resource provider is just the Terraform component. And then the Kubernetes operator is like applying or bringing in Flux or Argo CD, these other tools that don't necessarily do any provisioning of resources or infrastructure, but know how to run the program that does. And that's where the operator fits in.
Does the operator replace something like Argo CD and Flux, or does it work alongside them?
You can definitely use them alongside each other, but you can be just as successful running the Kubernetes operator. And that's the pattern I use on my own. I now just have Pulumi at CI/CD, Pulumi in the cluster, and Pulumi on my desktop. So just one tool to kind of make it all work.
Nice. Yeah, I wasn't really thinking before the show in thinking like let's show off this tool. But if we're going to do a GitOps workflow with Pulumi, I guess you're recommending that this would be the approach, the best approach, right? Like, is to use the operator, throw it in your clusters.
Yeah, it's advantageous to use the Pulumi Kubernetes operator over Argo CD and Flux because it really understands Pulumi because Pulumi wrote it. So you run a risk of using Argo CD or Flux, and it could start Pulumi up, and something could happen and it could exit, and you end up with this weird snapshot of state that is neither here nor there. And it's difficult for Pulumi to kind of recover from those situations without manual intervention. The Pulumi operator is built in a way that it knows how to snapshot more efficiently, so that if the pod were terminated, killed, the node was drained, a data center just shut down, then the Pulumi operator can still pick that back up and resume from where it left off. So there's some special knowledge built into it to handle those use cases. And Engine is right in the chat. The Pulumi operator is very similar to Crossplane, another really cool project in this space. Crossplane is the Pulumi is a Kubernetes operator that takes YAML manifests and Kubernetes custom resources to then also go and create cloud resources for you. So they're very, very similar projects with a slightly different take.
Yeah. Well, very cool. And we've done, we've had some demos before on this show with Pulumi, but never focused around the idea of GitOps and not really focused on anything like this Kubernetes operator. Do you have something you want to show us?
Well, I'll throw one more question at you first, and then we can talk about the demo. Because the demo, one of the things I'm trying to do with the Pulumi operator is try and promote better hygiene with GitOps. I feel like GitOps has moved so fast that we're at a point where we need to slow down and say, okay, are we actually doing this the right way? And I actually gave a talk on this, and GitOps Days, I can't remember, GitOps Days in 2020. But I gave it such a scientific name that I don't think anyone's ever watched it. So I called this talk like applying the law of Demeter to GitOps, which to me is like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, of course we want to, have better coupling within our systems and principle of least knowledge. But maybe I should have called it something catchier. So, okay, here's the law of Demeter. So it's about having systems that are loosely coupled and don't have too much knowledge about the other systems that are in orbit or surround them, etc., depending on the language that you want to use. So what I see with GitOps today, and the major tools here are Flux, and we've got Customize, or Customize can be used in a GitOps pattern, is that they embed the knowledge of all of the environments into the repository. And this is typically done with the overlay model. So you would have a directory for dev, a directory for staging, and a directory for prod. And you have like a base layer. And then we apply the patches depending on the environment that we're going to deploy to. And I just don't understand why we're putting all of this environmental knowledge into this Git style repository. Because to me, it feels like we should have one definition of what our application looks like and runs like. We had the 12-factor manifesto before Docker in containers, right? Where if we wanted to run apps in the cloud, then we have to inject the config because we just want to be able to build a container image once. And GitOps has went down, I believe, the wrong path, although I could be wrong myself, who knows? And I want us to have this concept of canonical GitOps, one canonical representation of our platform and our application that then can be run by the environment rather than the application running in an environment. Does that make sense?
Right. This goes into it's a similar conversation around microservice development. And I think I heard, I was on a show with Kelsey Hightower once that he had this great quote. I'm going to try to see if I can remember it. We were talking about microservice development and how using containers as, and whether it's Kubernetes or Docker or Compose or whatever, as a method for running all the dependent services while you're developing on a particular service, right? And that's very much more common it's common in everybody's workflow now, but it gets way worse with a microservice scenario. And he was talking about how he doesn't develop in containers because if I needed a whole bunch of things running in the background for me to test one of my microservices, then I'm really just developing a distributed monolith, not a microservice. And he was basically talking about this exact same problem, that everything was tightly coupled. So there was no opportunity for you to swap parts. And that's kind of what this whole modern CNCF DevOps approach is trying to teach us long term, is that if we can all agree on the points, where the points of integration are for all of our separate tools, and set those up as some sort of standard, then maybe we can all start swapping parts and build this thing together without having to change everything when you change one thing. Is that what you're trying to talk about?
There's definitely a component of that to it, definitely. Yeah. And the coupling goes beyond just like, microservices. We can definitely, it's so easy to couple them, right? That's the easy path. The hard path is loose coupling and being able to have systems that can be deployed independently. But yeah, GitOps is doing a similar trajectory, or this whole layered hierarchy thing for environmental knowledge. In fact, let's go through an example, right? You are doing GitOps now, Bret, and you've got this application. It deploys to a Kubernetes cluster. You've got overlays set up with customized for dev, staging, and prod, and then a product owner. I'll be the product owner. I come along and I go, hey, Bret, we really need a pre-prod testing environment for performance testing. Can you spin that up for me? And with your hierarchical approach to GitOps, well, you have to go to the Git directory, create a new directory, add all the overlays that describe how to run inside of this environment, and then push it and then deploy it to your environment. And that to me feels very much like an anti-pattern. It's like, why does my continuous integration component need to know about what the environments are? Mm-hmm. Especially if we want ephemeral environments. What if we want to spin up a new environment on every pull request and do integration tests across an entire thing? Do I have to then commit those automated into a Git repository and do that and then spit them back out and then delete them? And it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So why can't we just describe what our applications look like once? And then if the environment has to tweak anything, have the environment itself know what those variants are and apply them in the cluster. And that I think is the future of GitOps. And Pulumi makes that a lot easier than all these other tools.
Yeah. And I can certainly see how using traditional tools, you'd end up with a suite of tools in order to sort of accomplish that. And they don't necessarily all work together necessarily easy without writing shell scripts and other automations to do things. So I do feel like you're onto something with describing how it's all in the subtlety of the details, and these are more patterns and practices than this is a tool enforcing these things, which this is where we're living in the gray, essentially, as I would call it. Like there's black and white of like which tool you choose to do certain things, but then there's how you implement those tools. And that's really the hard part that's rarely talked about, especially past the 101 stage of every YouTube video ever made. And I think that's the hard part for us as educators, people that are in the community talking, doing, whether it's a live show or a conference talk. I'm always looking for ways to get deeper, maybe not a black belt session, but get deeper into showing how these tools connect to the other tools so that we all get a sense for, at the end of the day, when I want to talk to someone about, you're going to take on Kubernetes, this is going to be a thing, we're going to do this thing called Kubernetes, like what else do they have to worry about? And it not be this continuous like I don't want to show them the CNCF landscape chart and say, figure that out. I'd like to give them patterns that say, okay, well, these are the 3 tools that are going to get you 99% of the way there. Just use these 3 tools. You have to learn them. And because obviously we all, like the challenge with this Kubernetes landscape is that we learn Kubernetes and then that's just the beginning. And we really need all these other things to really get the job done. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah. I think this is a very unique situation, like with the CNCF containers and Kubernetes. like all this stuff is still super new, and it's almost become, some of these patterns are just a victim of the velocity the projects have moved. Like within the last 7 years, we've went from, traditional operator style stacks, bare metal machines, slight adoption of cloud compute, and then just flew right through to containers, Kubernetes, distributed systems, microservices. And you're like, whoa, hold on a minute. Like, now there are some people in the community that have been on top of it, like yourself, playing with containers, educating people on containers. But there's still 80% of the developer technical world that are maybe still working with virtual machines and monolithic applications, deploying to bare metal servers. And the speed that we've adapted to this cloud native landscape, I think, has caused a few cracks and patterns and bad practices to slip in, but we have hopefully plenty of time to try and correct some of this stuff as well. So
yeah, I think the future is be nimble. Like, we haven't all figured out these things, so just expect that whatever you're running now or even implementing now might not be the same thing you're using in a couple of years, at least for the foreseeable future.
Well, yeah, definitely. Like right now, when there's a problem that hasn't been solved in Kubernetes or cloud native, like the solution is always some hacky project from some developer that is in this space that ends up getting some traction, and then it's like, all right, okay, we're going down this path now. And there's never that longer term thought process, thinking about it, looking at other ways. Well, I'm sure other people are doing this, but because, again, it's only been 7 years and we're all doing containers, distributed systems, Kubernetes on the cloud. Like, it's just the speed that we're doing this. We're solving problems as we hit them, maybe not taking enough time. And that's a really sweeping statement, and I hate myself for saying it, but not taking enough time to really look at the bigger picture of where we need to be in another 10 years time. So.
Right. Yeah, and then I think when I talk a lot about just the adoption of containers, I talk a lot about the speed aspect, that every major technology shift we've had, at least in my lifetime, has always been about speed. Not necessarily speed of memory and processors, although that is a factor, but it's just speed about taking a business idea and getting in front of customers and then doing that over and over and over again. And everything in the middle is up for grabs. Everything in the middle is is in a state of flux at all times. And I think a lot of us just really, sometimes we just have this feeling of, I just want one tool or two tools, and I want to be the same tool in 5 years. And I'm just, sadly, thing is, I don't know how realistic that is anymore. So maybe a tool like Pulumi that is in a language can work around all these changes in the future. But as we pick up something else, like there's purpose-fit tools like Argo or Flux, and they're great right now, but will they still be the tool to solve the job in 3 years, right? If we're constantly learning and creating these new patterns all the time. So anyway, we could talk about this forever. Like, I feel like we could make a series of podcasts about all this stuff and like where this is headed. But let's talk about some things that people can do today. Like with this idea of the operator, the GitOps model that we've now defined for those that are just joining, because it is YouTube, so people come in and out every 5 minutes. Is this the pattern that you're approaching it with your projects? Like using the GitOps operator for Kubernetes? Obviously, like, to me, Kubernetes is table stakes. It's the ground floor that we're building all this stuff, these ideas on now. So we're using Pulumi. We've got this operator inside our cluster, and we're using GitOps patterns, which means we're storing our Pulumi code in its own repo. Like, how does this kind of play out for someone who's getting started?
Well, why don't I show you my real life Pulumi usage, and maybe that can answer a few questions. And if anyone watching has questions, feel free to drop them in and we'll tackle them as we go. But let's just show you what I do. I think would be a good start. So,
yeah. And hello, Cloud Native FM. Saeem's in here. He says he gave us some props. I appreciate that. Thank you, kind sir.
All right. And I also see Conrad said that he really enjoyed my Rust language episodes. And are there any plans for Pulumi to support Rust lang? I am really fighting the good fight with that. I am such a huge Rust fanboy these days. I'm writing Kubernetes operator in Rust just this morning. So, I would love to say Pulumi was working on Rust support. We're not working on Rust support, but I will continue to fight that good fight.
Yeah, there needs to be a feature request area that we can send Conrad to upvote something.
Well, strangely enough, the most requested language for Pulumi is Ruby. Yeah, I haven't written any Ruby in in 10 years, but it is our most popular request.
I do work with multiple teams currently that are, well, multiple organizations that are all using Ruby. And I happen to, I don't know, I feel like I got my start in the startup space when I started getting into startup stuff 12 years ago. This is a long time ago. Everybody was doing Ruby back then. And so I know a lot of those people, and they're all still very much Ruby. So I'm not voting for any particular languages, but I do. That is a real thing, and people do still use Ruby very much. So, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just perspective, right? But I used to write some Ruby, and then Elixir happened, I think 2014, 2015, and everyone started moving over there. So I wrote Elixir for a few years. I just, because I didn't write it anymore myself, I just assumed no one else wrote it, right? That's
right.
how the brain works.
Right. That's all as we all have our own worldview of especially of programming. Yeah. That's why I think that, like, going on a total tangent here, Stack Overflow's developer survey to me is probably one of the most valuable, because it is not biased on any one. I mean, obviously there's a bias towards programmers, but I don't feel like it's biased on like the CNCF or a particular tool or a particular, Gartner or whatever's access to different, Fortune 500 companies or whatever. So I feel like it's always a good measure, and these languages are all always extremely popular. And it's always, like Cold Fusion, which it's not called Cold Fusion anymore, is still a thing, and there's still people developing it. I was just at their conference 3 years ago giving a Docker talk, and I was it wasn't a huge conference, but I mean there's still people doing it, even though I thought it was gone 15 years ago.
And they're running their Cold Fusion in containers? Is that happening?
Yeah. In fact, I ran a workshop for a CMS running on Cold Fusion. And we were teaching everybody how to use, well, at the time it was Docker Swarm, and we skipped Kubernetes for that short one. We just wanted to show them basic orchestration. But yeah, we were trying to say, hey, look, like everything's going into containers, so you people too need to be in containers now. So yeah, I mean, I think once you create a language, it doesn't die. Like, it never goes away. There's always going to be somebody developing.
Well, here's a question for you: are we still going to have containers in 5 years, or will we all be compiling to WebAssembly?
Yeah, no, I'm not jumping on that bandwagon.
Well, you might not have a choice, right?
Yeah, I think that WebAssembly is nice, but it's one of those things where the thing that Docker got right is that everybody got to come along on that ride, right? Like no one was excluded from the Docker container revolution. It was not environment or language or processor, and it had no limits, right? And I deal in a brownfield world where everything is existing code and everyone's got existing projects, and not that you need to write from scratch, but I feel like if it excludes anything or anyone, it's probably not going to be the majority of people. So that's just
I think what we'll see is Kubernetes will start to support multiple runtimes. We'll have Kubernetes APIs running container workloads, WebAssembly workloads, unikernel workloads. I think that landscape is going to expand, and we'll see a lot more innovation in there. I do think the Kubernetes API will be here in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
You can quote me on that.
I do. I agree completely. I do think the Docker file and the Kubernetes API, like the two things, whether it's called the Docker file or container file or whatever, doesn't matter. The idea of a build document that is written in this bashish language a little bit, and then the idea that we have this consistent API. I think the last couple of weeks I've been talking about, like, if you're in this config space, if any of you are like diehard sysadmins from back in the day, we had the config DB, and we had all sorts of tools that would manage the config DB. And I think that was that thing. That is still more or less a consistent thing today, but now we have this application version of that, and that is the Kubernetes API. It is the now standard for all developers to deploy against, and it's the list of constraints. I think the Weaveworks podcast, I keep mentioning it lately because it's been on my mind, but the Weaveworks Modern Ops podcast, for those of you who like podcasts, that's a great podcast that talks about operations. They had a great episode recently where they talked about that Kubernetes is really a list of constraints that developers can design their architecture against. And I love that approach of saying, like, the Kubernetes API is just sort of, it's going to be there. Assume it's what you're going to use. Eventually, it's probably going to be what you do for everything, including serverless, like you're saying. So yeah. Totally. I'm on board with what you're thinking. All right, demo.
All right, so this is my infrastructure project that essentially manages everything that I need online. One of the things I always show people is just, like, you can use Pulumi to manage your DNS records, which is very cool. So here I have something called a controller. You don't really need to know what that is. That is an abstraction that I have built and other people could use, where we provide a domain name and we get a zone back from the other side. So we have a DNS zone that we can work with. Now, I mean, imagine none of that other code was there, and we just had this that we copy and pasted off the internet, and we're like, all right, how do we work with this thing? And because Pulumi is in TypeScript and we have a really good language server protocol, we can just autocomplete through the API, which I think is amazing. So I now see I have functions called create an MX record, create a proxied record, create a record, disable email, and then some other stuff. So we're just a few clicks. I can say, okay, it needs a name. So I'll call this Bret. And then this takes a type. So, okay, maybe it's an A record. And then it takes the list of values. And then I can just say, hey, all right, we'll point it to some DNS server. So that, I call this the rich interface, like being able to use the rich ecosystem of tools from my preferred programming language to write my Pulumi program. I think it's just a super selling point. Here, this is my real domain. This is my G Suite MX records. I've got my site verification for my Google Analytics and other stuff, DMARC records for emails, domain keys, my store, my short URLs for sharing links and videos and stuff like that. And really, really simple. Now, of course, if I want to dive into what I'm actually doing here, then you'll find out, hey, look, I actually use Cloudflare. So I'm using the Pulumi Cloudflare resource provider. I built a component resource that adds all these nice, convenient functions that creates all the records. And that's how I manage all my DNS. I think it's a really nice system. And because we're all developers and we buy far too many domains, why would you not want to codify that, right?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, Cloudflare, if any of you haven't used Cloudflare, it's awesome. And I think about once every 5, maybe 10 years, I move my way too many, I don't know, 30, 40 domains, whatever I have, every good idea I've ever had in my life, right? I move them to a new provider. And I used to be on Hover for the longest time, loved Hover because they're old school 2cows. If anybody out there has been around long enough to know 2cows, they were like the original file download system, 20 some years ago. And they still exist, and they have this hover.com. And I used to be my jam, but it was very limited in terms of developer, and there was no support for anything. There was very little support for things like this, right? It wasn't popular enough to have providers or whatever. And so now, and I've always hesitated going to a cloud specific one, just because I kind of feel like I want my DNS to be agnostic. So I too have been moving a lot to Cloudflare, and it's cheaper, ironically, which I always felt like the other ones were always so cheap, but. I'm with you. I'm looking at this going, okay, this is probably going to be my gateway drug into Pulumi, is just to codify all of the management of all of my resources and assets that I have related to DNS, because I do a lot of short linking and I have way too many domains. By the way, Bret.live, DevOps.fan, like all these domains above me, like you can see all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the beauty here, right? Is like I could swap out Cloudflare really easily by modifying this one class, and all my domains would move over. And we can also.
Oh wow, that's cool. Yeah.
The next thing on my list is to have alias domains. So you'll see here that I have, my short URL one, my Rawkode Academy, which is just a short URL one, Rawkode.live and Rawkode.sh, Rawkode.news. These are all just pointing to the same short URL service. And my plan is to actually just add alias thing and then add more domains to bring under control and even reduce this duplication even further. So because we're using a programming language, we can build abstractions that make sense for us in our domain and take advantage of that as much as possible. So
right,
really, really cool.
Like it.
All right, let's see something a bit more interesting. We have a concept of a platform as well, and I also have a concept of a cluster. I too swap clouds, DNS providers, and if there's a new service out there, the chances are I will try it for a period of time. So you can see that I have the concept of a Civo cluster, a Google Cloud cluster, and a Scaleway cluster. Like I'm always just playing with managed Kubernetes to see which one works for me. So right now we're on Scaleway, really cool service. I'm enjoying theirs right now. But if I go to here, this is the actual entry point to my infrastructure as code. Or to my, what is this file? Is this platform? Yeah, okay, no, that's it. Okay, cool. This is the entry point to my infrastructure as code. So I'm just doing some imports from all the abstractions that I've already created. And then I just create a new Kubernetes cluster with the node pools that I need. And these methods called add node pool, these are things that I created to define how I wanted to define what a node pool was. I then have this thing called a platform. Again, you don't know where it is, but it's doing stuff. And I then have this nice Fluent API where I can add things to my platform. I'm using Contour, a Rust-based ingress controller for Kubernetes. Cert Manager, of course. Tyke, which is an API gateway. It does some cool stuff. Red Panda, which is like the Kafka killer. I don't know if you're familiar with Red Panda, but it is super amazing.
I am not, but now I am.
Well, if you ever need to run Kafka and then you're like, oh, it's got a JVM and it requires Zookeeper and it's going to bring down my Kubernetes cluster, then Red Panda is written in C++. It's fully Kafka API compatible. I mean, they don't pay me any money. I'm just telling you how much I love their product. But Red Panda is now just what I drop in instead of Kafka every single time.
It's actually the reason why whenever someone tries to get me into Kafka, I go and read the website and documentation. I'm like, nope, never mind. Don't care. I do not need this yet. I do not care enough to do all this work. So
I have a rule, no JVM in my Kubernetes clusters, because as much as they're improving the JVM to understand C groups and be a good container citizen, it's just not good enough yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm using this add component helper to add whatever I need to my cluster, and then I can onboard projects. So I'm just saying, hey, go add the Rawkode Academy project, which runs some automation stuff that I need for my YouTube channel. So I just say, hey, this is the repository you should watch. It uses this ingress component, and here's the environment. And this is what I'm talking about with the canonical GitOps. And the autocomplete wasn't covering that. This is what I'm talking about with the canonical GitOps and not having overlays. It's like this code is actually responsible for deploying the environment. So give this all of those constraints and changes that have to happen at the environment level. My applications don't need to know that it's running in dev, staging, or prod. The environment should just change the way that it's going to behave, either by modifying an HPA, providing a config map like I'm doing here with the domain information that you need for ingress, and then let the two have that binding contract that's like, okay, my application will run as long as these pieces of information are available, and the platform will provide those pieces of information.
So sorry, let me ask a question real quick on that. So so you have this example here. So this is an environment you're defining. Is when I want to add another environment, in this case, in your design, what would I be adding? Would I be adding more code, more Pulumi code? Is it like some?
No.
Okay.
I've let you down a slightly bad path here, and this API is hard-coded. What I would actually do is come into my pulumi.prod. So this is what describes an environment. I would say that my infrastructure API domain is api.rawkode.academy. And then in my code here, I would be a much better Pulumi citizen and not do this. Instead, I would do require string, and this would be my API. This is a red squiggle, again, because I'm using a language that's got an LSP. Tell me config doesn't have anything called that. The new Pulumi. Shame on me. From Pulumi. Let's grab config. I can do new config. If I got another config somewhere. Don't lie to me. Require. Oh, there's no require string. It's just require because string's the default.
Okay.
So if it's actually corrected me and I was calling it a liar, I'm sorry, TypeScript. So this is how you would do it. And now this code, this platform code, is actually agnostic of the environment itself. And then I would create a new stack, which is just a new YAML file, and I would change this for each thing that I need. But this is good here because my applications are not aware. This is the platform constructor that is aware of the environment.
Okay, so it correlates to like one environment is one Pulumi YAML or one or more
One
Pulumi
Pulumi
YAMLs.
stack.
Okay.
And I can spin this Pulumi code up as many times as I want with a different stack. I could have 100 of them. I could have 2 of them. I could have 1,000 of them. And it doesn't matter. I would get a completely new, exactly the same environment every single time.
Okay. And they don't necessarily have to be in the same repo? Or is that the sort of like what you're proposing here?
This would be one repo. This would be your infrastructure or your platform repository. This is where you would define what your infrastructure looks like. You only want to do that once. You don't want to have branches. You don't want to have forks. You don't want to have directories with tweaks. You just want to define it once and say, this is what an environment looks like. We want them all to be the same. That's the goal.
Right. So this would replace like an Argo repo if I stuck my overrides and
so maybe So this is the terraforming bit we're looking at right now, not the GitOps bit right now. So let's move on to that.
Okay. Good point.
Now, I don't want to have to run and change this, so I'm going to be a bad citizen.
It's a demo.
Just in case we actually run a Pulumi up.
Yeah, but it's great to point out, like, we're doing this for demo. Don't do this. This is how you should do it.
I'm iterating on this very fast. I'm the one that's making compromises as I need. This should have been loaded from config, but we'll skip over that for now. And I have another instance where this is hard-coded that I don't know how long we can go over. I know we are out of time almost, but maybe
no, you're fine. Let's keep going.
So this is the cluster code, the DNS. This is the terraforming stuff. But then this here, where we add a project, this is when we're now getting into GitOps. And in fact, if we go take a look, in fact, did I already? Yeah. This is the Rawkode Academy repository that has a platform directory. And you can see I'm iterating on this now. This is only 11 days old. This is all fresh and being built. But we just have another Pulumi project with a source directory with an index file that is pulling in some function called deploy stack.
Can you zoom on that a little bit? Can you do a zoom? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is the TypeScript thing that has some function called deploy a stack. Again, I don't know what that means. I don't know how it works, but we give it a name called data embassy and it does the thing. And if I click on this, we'll see that it is a function that creates a stack secret, creates a Kubernetes secret, installs a custom resource. It's provisioning the Kubernetes cluster with everything that it needs for the Kubernetes operator to then go and deploy something else. And it's another stack. So this is stackception. I have a Pulumi stack within a stack. And this is like the Argo CD app of apps approach, if you're familiar with that.
All right.
So this then says, okay, well, watch this same repository, only this time we're going to monitor a different directory and deploy whatever it wants. And if we pop back up, we have projects data embassy here, which has this directory, which is another Pulumi program, is Pulumi all the way down. And this one deploys one of it's the API for my YouTube channel. So if you want to like query, filter, search for all my episodes without going to YouTube, you can actually use, is it running right now? Am I about to look really, really stupid? Hold on. It is running. So we have a GraphQL API here. I can say get all live streams, give me the title, give me, what else do we have? The YouTube ID, technologies themselves are an SD type that have a name. We hit go, and then I can see there's clustered, there's a YouTube ID, no technologies. Am I going to find one with a technology? I need to tag my episodes better. But you can see I can query all my episodes, which is really important for my automation. And I can do that over GraphQL. So let's make a change to this then. Let's see this working. So if I run get stacks, this is the Academy stack at the top level, which deploys the Embassy stack. And the Embassy stack, it's an Academy namespace, which is running those two workloads. So Pulumi is deploying more Pulumi, deploying more Pulumi. And I don't need to do anything besides make a change to this directory. Now, we could try and be very bold and replace this hard-coded reference to the API, because I now can no longer deploy a new environment without it having a clash of DNS.
Right.
Or we can take the easy path and just add Nginx as a resource and push it. How brave are you feeling, Brett?
What's faster?
Oh, you're trying to get rid of me, right? Okay.
No.
let's add Nginx, because we can deploy that first, and then we'll try and do the domain thing in 5 minutes. If not,
okay.
Right?
I was actually motivated by, if it crashes and doesn't work, we always tend to learn more when we troubleshoot. So I was just like, do whatever works fastest, and then if it doesn't work, we're going to troubleshoot. By the way, thank you so much to the donations we've had. I get to do the over-the-top reggae horn for Ejendiri and Nuno. Captain Nuno both donated to the UNHCR for Ukraine. Thank you so much. That means a lot.
Definitely. The Ukrainian people need our help right now, and every little bit helps. Okay, let's deploy Nginx first, and then we'll do the fun thing. So, I mean, I know my way around this API, but I'm just going to tab complete all the way through. So what does a Kubernetes deployment look like? Well, going to type. It has a spec. Okay, what does the spec have? Well, let's just use the autocomplete. Replicas. Well, give me one of them for now. All right, what's next? Let's see. Something weird with my help and the autocomplete. But well, we need a template. The template also has a spec, which has containers, which is a list of objects. The container has a name. It has an image. Hit save. I've got a red squiggle, so I've forgotten something. Okay, it's telling me that we need selectors. Of course we do. So we pop back up here. The selectors at the top. I have one hard available. Yeah, here. Let's just use the app labels. Do this. All this Nginx labels. And Nginx. Selector. And that's got match labels, Nginx labels. And we need here labels, Nginx.
For those of those watching and joining, what we're doing right now is we're basically codifying Kubernetes YAML at this point, right? Like we're replacing the need to write the Kubernetes manifest or the Helm chart or the customized templates, and we're doing it inside your preferred language.
Yeah, correct. So I am assuming that I haven't messed anything up now, and I think we're actually going to deploy Nginx. If we take a look at our namespace, we have no Nginx. So let's do a selective add here. Don't deploy the wrong thing. Yes. Nope. That was some debugging from earlier. Nope. We only want to deploy that change. I'll say add Nginx. And we will push. We will.
Yay, demos! By the way, I have implemented 1Password SSH keys based on your notification to the internet that you have done it. I was like, oh, this is cool, and I immediately did it that day. I'm a fan.
What is wrong with it? All right, I'm going to open from. Okay, let's try pull. Oh, I can't because of that. Is GitHub done?
It was. This would be the second time this week, wouldn't it?
All right. Let's do.
Maybe try a GH login.
So I do have GH actually. Let's see. Does that help me push? No, you can't do that. Yeah.
Let's see. Incident, experience degraded performance, migrations to GitHub are paused, current status, GitHub actions is degraded. So supposedly Git operations are normal.
There is a way to test this. You can do ssh to git at github.com. And then we can turn on, is it getting the right keys?
Is it maybe 1Password using the wrong key? That doesn't make any sense because it would.
SSH key dash add dash L. Yeah, this looks perfect. I want to try a pull from here.
That is wild.
All right, let's go to another project. Do a get reset or pull. All right, I cannot.
That's weird. Can you do like a GH clone repo of something and just see if I don't know, I'm spitballing.
In the interest of time, I'm going to swap my SSH socket over to my old one. And
so for those of you watching, both of us now are using 1Password to manage our SSH keys, which until this moment I have not seen an issue. It's actually a really brand new beta feature. It's very nice. I actually very much like it. And it's probably going to cause me to, instead of using one key for most things, I'm probably going to start using separate keys for various things because it makes it so much easier to do that.
Well, switching to my old SSH key has worked, so clearly I need to restart 1Password. But let's not worry about that just now.
It is beta. It is beta. We are writing beta, so somehow it must have, I don't know, approved the wrong key or something. Yeah, it seems like it. Anyway, didn't matter. All right, we're back.
So I'm not going to touch anything. There's no workflows on that repository to deploy anything. This is all happening inside the cluster. So when we next look, we should see that we have the Nginx. But I really want to solve this. So part of the canonical GitOps, my platform provides to me a contract. That contract is a config map called environment. The context. Okay. This is my contract between my platform and my applications. And right now, the only contract is that I will provide a domain that you will expose your API on, and that is all. So what we want to do with Pulumi, and this is really hard to do with Argo and Flux. In fact, it's impossible to do with Argo and Flux. You have to revert to using a mutating admission controller like Kyverno that will look up the config map, modify the ingress as it is injected to the API server, and spit it back out. Pulumi, it's a bit nicer. So we're going to say, okay, we have an environment config map, and that is Kubernetes core v1 config map.get environment. Why are you complaining at me? Oh yeah, we need some more information. Another ID, and we'll need to provide the provider, which is, well, no, we don't have a provider because it's in cluster. Awesome. Okay, even better. This gets me the config map. Now I can say, well, this is actually the environment data.get API domain. And this is now complaining because we have it wants a string and I'm giving it a promise string, which means that we have to do, we could try interpolate. So this is to do with the input-output system of Pulumi. And yeah, this is expecting, let's try it down here too. Why expected 0? Oh, it might be in really silly. So we have this. All right, okay. So excuse me while I fumble my way through. I did not rehearse this. All right, cool. This now gets
I think we're pointing out, just pointing out how helpful the inline help and arguments is. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, again, because we're using a language with an entire ecosystem of tools to help us write this code better, it applies in the Pulumi, which is awesome. So and as the operator runs, we're looking up the environmental config map, the contract, and we're going to try and replace that into these two parts of here so that we never have any hard-coded constraints that would affect our ability to launch permanent, semi-permanent, or ephemeral environments. Now, before I break all of this, because this is completely off the cuff, let's run git pods. At least we have nginx, right? One thing has worked.
Yes. So for those of you just joining, we didn't have nginx. Then we wrote some code, and now we have nginx in Kubernetes. It was zero YAML written.
Remove.
Or at least zero Kubernetes YAML written.
I'm now trying to say my commit, so which is not part of my new key. Go back to my old shell. And here, where the old agent is still configured, remove. Oh, let's see, Contraya. There we go. Commit. People are watching this just thinking I am absolutely off my mind. Remove hard-coded. That signed it with the old key. This will push it with the new key. And
look at that.
We'll see. So now we have to wait 1 minute. We run a Academy get pods on a watch.
So this is we're waiting on the operator to detect changes, right? And then
I have the operator and the stack configured on a 60-second interval. So if we come into this add project function, which creates a new project, and then at the bottom of that, it creates a stack. And as part of that stack description, there's a lot going on here. We have, I don't actually define it, so it's using the default. We have an option here where we can say the resync interval, which is 60 seconds by default. So we wait 60 seconds and hope for the best. Now, what could happen here is I got the input-output system wrong, which means if I describe the YAML, we'll see Pulumi.output, then JSON blob as the metadata name, or in fact, that would probably just fail because you couldn't have that as the metadata name, which means that we have to do a Pulumi interpolate in the code. The input-output system takes a little bit of getting used to. I've been using Pulumi 4 years and I still get it wrong from time to time. So we'll just deal with that if we have to. I can tackle that question in the chat just now while we wait, though. YK says, does Pulumi have something like a state file? It does. So for developers, storing your state on the Pulumi SaaS is free. You can have as many Pulumi projects as you want and never have to worry about where the state lives, which is amazing. If you don't want to use Pulumi SaaS, you can use any S3 compatible blob storage. So Google GCS, Amazon S3, AKS, etc., and store it there. That works just fine. You can use local state, which is what I use in the Kubernetes context. Why am I using local state? Well, because if I shut down the cluster, the state is completely irrelevant. I don't create any resources outside of the cluster. So I just use local state and keep it in there, and it's quite happy. So
that is cool.
I don't know if I'm being impatient, but what we can do is take a look at our operator logs and see if I'm getting a big, nasty error. So my platform namespace, we have, where's my operator? I thought it was in platform. Oh no, it's in Academy, it's there, okay. Academy. Ah, drat. I haven't given my operator access to read config maps. We could fix that. So again, we are 20 minutes over. I'll let you be the judge, but I'll show you where the problem is, and then you can decide. When we deploy the operator as part of the platform, we create a service account. As part of that service account, oh, it's got star. I don't know what's wrong.
We gave it everything, and it's still not happy.
Yeah, it says it cannot get the resource config maps, an API group, and namespace default.
Yeah, okay.
This is a bug in the operator. So I actually fixed this bug in the operator a couple of days ago. So
I've been saying RBAC strikes again. If it's not DNS, which is the golden rule on Kubernetes, it's probably RBAC, if not DNS.
There was this annoying bug in the operator that assumes if you don't provide a namespace to use default, which I have told everyone is not how we want this to work. And fix the bug. So I'm just going to apply this to the default namespace. Which should give me that there. And I'm not going to do anything more. If it doesn't work now, then I tried. We will see if it restarts the next time it does the sync. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, well, no worries.
Could this be an episode of...
Yeah.
I think I'm following. Hopefully those that have been hanging around have been following along. Maybe this is an episode of Klustered where you break your own and then you have to fix it.
Yeah. It was just a bug in the operator. It has been fixed, I promise. I just don't think a release has been cut. And if it has, I certainly haven't updated my operator in the last 2 days. So that's why I have to duplicate my config map to the default namespace.
But this is an interesting pattern. I'm glad we kind of went into some of the weeds of this because you're doing real stuff here, and that's better, I think, than a 30-second demo of what Pulumi can do specifically for Kubernetes, right? For those of us that are living our life in a DevOps context, so we're constantly, whether we're developers full-time or not, but we're spending so much time in Kubernetes command lines, Kubernetes YAML, whether it's Helm, whatever, and seeing if I were to take on Pulumi as a tool, like what would my days look like, right? Like what kind of patterns would I be implementing? What changes would I be making in Git as a part of my job to manage infrastructure with Pulumi? And I think this is, at least for me, someone who's not used it before, it's super helpful to get an idea of, okay, I like this, like choosing a language and then writing in that language with help inside of VS Code is, I think, greatly appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. I also realized something else as you were talking. I'm watching for a pod to restart. But did you notice what resource we modified? It wasn't the pod. We modified the project contour proxy, which probably has been updated now. Because it's a proxy, I'm going to delete it.
An HTTP proxy resource? Is that what we did?
Yeah, we updated
you
the proxy.
I watched. Yeah, okay.
So let's just delete it, and then it'll be recreated. It won't be recreated if the Pulumi code is currently wrong, but I have to have some level of confidence now. How many things can I get wrong in 10 minutes? I'm not sure.
Well, and that's another, like we were talking earlier, that's another thing. We were talking about failures earlier in the show. For those that were here earlier, we were talking about just how like failure is a part of success in this, well, in this world as humans, but also very much in server management, DevOps development, right? Like you start from a place of everything's broken, and then you eventually make everything right, and then we deploy, and then things might break, and then we just have to fix them. And that's very much not, especially for those, because a lot of people on this show, or that show up on this show, are coming from my courses, so they tend to be newer at containers and DevOps. And I think sometimes we all have unrealistic expectations about how correct we all are the first time we do something, or even the 10th time we do something, and we're just not. And I think a friend of mine, Colt Steele, who actually has a very popular million people have taken his Udemy course on web development, but he actually paid a friend to track, like he's a senior developer at maybe a FANG company or something, and the guy basically gave him his browser history for a day, and he was able, or record his screen or for a day or something, and he brought it all down to basically what did he learn, like what happened throughout the day, and most of it was trying something in code, it doesn't work, trying again, doesn't work, going to Stack Overflow, searching for a solution, spending an hour on a thing that should have taken 10 minutes. And this was a senior developer, right? Like and it was a senior developer at a real big tech company. So it wasn't just, someone who was air quotes senior. And I also find this to be very true of DevOps and operations as well. I mean, I think in terms of like the most popular pages over the last 5 years of my Google Chrome are the Docker build documentation, like for Docker files, the Docker Compose documentation, and Kubernetes.io, like the documentation for Kubernetes. Like I just live on these sites, and no matter how many times I do things, there's always some little option that I don't remember or I don't understand. We're always learning.
Yeah, what makes you a senior or someone who's good at this isn't getting things right first time every time. It's reducing the time to recovery from failure, like seeing a problem and then fixing it. Like we get better at that. You get better at understanding the constraints and how to find solutions to problems. We don't immediately, after 10 years in the industry, just do everything right the first time, because
for sure,
not how it works.
Well, while we're waiting here, let's review real quick for everyone watching the Rawkode show. When do you air? When do you normally go live?
Klustered is every Thursday mostly, but I do try and stream a couple of times a week, but there's no set schedule. I really just reach out to people working on something cool and see when they join me, and then we stream. So at least every week, but no set time.
Right. Oh, okay. So basically subscribe and click the bell on his channel so you will get notified when he goes live. I am, by the way, a subscriber. I'm just not logged in. So I am a fan of this show. I also am a fan of your colors. We have those colors in common. Your background colors is what I'm specifically talking about. And we're both on Twitter. You can actually find, it's just over here, Rawkode. He's Rawkode everywhere, right? Like that's how you roll.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And also check out Pulumi. That's where he works. He's a developer advocate. Also a CNCF ambassador. I did not mention that at the beginning, but he is the community support for all these CNCF projects that are never ending.
Yep.
All right, let's do one last check here. Or did you give up?
No, it's still complaining about RBAC and my config map. So I'm hiding the screen. We're not going to look at it anymore.
Okay, didn't happen. It never happened. This will be cut out in post. So for those of you watching, if you just joined us, this show turns into a podcast. I take out the demos. Actually, the team takes out the demos. I don't do all the work, but we edit it down to the best parts. And so you basically get a hyper condensed Rawkode discussion around GitOps and Pulumi for basically DevOps automation in your Kubernetes clusters. And that show comes out on Thursdays, so we're a couple weeks behind. So you can get all those links below. We're both on YouTube. We're both on Twitter. We're basically the same person. You can't really. we just live on different sides of the pond. Anything else? Yeah. Any other ways for people to reach out to you?
Twitter's the best way. I'm Rawkode there. I'm always happy to help people. You said I'm a CNCF ambassador and I'm a cloud native support. I mean, yeah, I spend a great amount of my time just trying to help people with cloud native technologies because it's difficult. It's fast moving. It changes. So yeah, if you do need any help with anything, I have office hours. The link's on my Twitter profile. Come and say hello.
Very nice. People can reach out for direct support. Don't abuse it.
We kind of do. Yeah.
Don't abuse it, internet. Be nice. He's nice. Be nice to him. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It's absolutely okay that the demos didn't go perfect because I think this really highlights just like we got stuff done. We showed off some stuff, and not everything goes perfect the first time. And I think that it's great that more demos are like that. Like,
well, we did
that's
deploy
maybe
Nginx. Let's focus on the win here, right? We used GitOps with Pulumi to deploy Nginx. So
that did work. That was fantastic.
That did work. Yes.
And for those of you just joining, so sorry. We're not going to be able to get to your questions. We've been going for 90 minutes already today. But come join us next week. Let's see. I think next week, actually, this is a good point. Next week, I won't necessarily be doing a live show here. That might change last minute. But next week is Docker's Community All Hands. So next Thursday, all morning, Pacific time morning, U.S. Pacific, they will be doing an all hands, and I will be speaking there actually on this very topic, not Pulumi specifically, but on GitOps and GitOps approaches to building your Docker images and what you should do with those when okay, you've built it, great, it's done, but how do you build it? How do you use caching? How do you do all the different things around images like CVE scanning and whatnot? And I'll be doing a talk there. So come join us. Let's just go to docker.com. You can sign up for free. That's all day next Thursday. And then what do we have for guests next month? We have HashiCorp showing up. We got Shippa showing up. We got Rosemary Wang, the author of Patterns and Practices for Infrastructure as Code, on next month. We've got Docker Desktop for Linux. Docker's going to be on the show and show off the new Docker Desktop for Linux. I think very many of us are looking forward to that, and we're finally going to have full parity of Docker Desktop on all three major OSs. Sorry, free BSD people. There's just like no hope for you. I'm so sorry. But thanks again, Rawkode, David. Appreciate it. You can see him live next week or this week on his channel.
Well, Klustered is back next week, but thank you for having me. I had an absolute blast. Good fun.
We'll do it again. Sounds good. All right. Bye, everybody. Ciao.
Adios.